Welcome back, guys. Today we want to look at data structures, and specifically we're only going to look at lists and arrays, and we want to look at list methods. So there are other data structures. This particular lesson we just want to focus on the one because there is quite a lot to see and learn here. So let's crack on. Before I go into the rest of my slides, let me first go to my code editor and I want to show you an example. So this is an example of a variable, right? Our variable here holds one value. We've got a variable called name and we know it holds one value. How does a list differ or an array differ? So in this example, we have an example of a list. And you can see here that just like a variable, we've got, the identifier, then we have the equal symbol, and then what we have is square brackets. And the square brackets signify where the list begins, or the array, or where the list ends, at the end here. And that we have several items, so now we're able to store more than one item under a variable identifier. And each item is separated by a comma. Those are the key things to remember. Okay, so I've got one small thing here that might be a little bit confusing. I hope it's not. And I just want to go through it with you because you need to know this for your exams. When we program in Python, lists and arrays, although there is a way to do them differently, I don't want you to worry about that. You never have to know it. When we code in Python, let's just assume that lists and arrays are the same thing. Okay. But for your exams, in an exam, you might come across questions that differentiate the two, right? So in other programming languages, an array and a list are two separate things. And what it basically means is an array is what we call a static data structure. Let's make sense of that. So a static data structure means that when we create our array, how many items that we say our array can store has to be identified at the beginning. So for creating an array, I might say names and 4. Now, I've given an identifier, and then in square brackets, I have added 4, which signifies that this data structure has 4 slots that I can add data to, right? So it can hold 4 items. If I wanted that to be 5, so let's make that 5, but I've got 4 here, I would need a 5th space and maybe with just a blank, a blank string, or to be fair, just a comma will identify that there's a 5th slot there, right? So that's an array. And what we mean by it being static is that we can't increase the amount of items there are here and we can't decrease them. So we have to signify at the beginning while creating it, we have to identify that it holds 5 items or 4 items or 100. Yeah. Now, when it comes to lists are not static. So what that means is while the program is running, we can remove items from the list and we can grow it. So if we had 5 items, we can keep adding items and growing our list. So that would make it not static, right? Right. For the rest of the lesson, whenever I speak about a list or an array, just assume that because we're coding in Python, they're both the same thing. Although, like I said, in an exam situation, you need to know the difference between the two, as we mentioned a second ago, right? So here's an example. I've got an array or a list, and I've called it favorite underscore books, and it's got 3 items. The thing I want you to take home right now is that each item is indexed. So the first item is 0, the second item is 1, and then the third item is 2. So in programming languages, we always start counting from 0. So it says here that item number 1 is fav underscore books 0. So if I was to print that out, it should return the Martian, which is the first item in my list. Just like how we reassign variables, we can also reassign items in a list. But look at the way it's done here. So we've given the identifier, the variable name, and then using square brackets, we've said which item we want to make a change to. So in this case, the second item, which, like we said, we start counting from 0. So the second item would be the Gruffalo. And we're changing that to the BFG. Let's do a very quick example of that. Let me remove this extra one. Okay, and let's say here that let's print what names is. So let's print names. And then what we'll say is names, let's do item number 1 equals from Alfie, let's change that to Lewis. And then what we'll do is we'll print names one more time. So this time, sorry, not there, right, when I run that, you can see here that Alfie has been changed to Lewis. Okay. Moving on, I want us to look at the len function, or the lem function. Now we already did that a few lessons back when we looked at strings. And we know that the len function will let us know how many characters there are in a string. However, the interesting thing about this is that it changes behavior when we use it with a list or an array. So if we look at this, let's delete these for a second. I'm going to write print, oops, my bad. I'm going to write print the length of len, and in my parenthesis I'm going to give the argument name. Let's do the same thing one more time. This time we'll do that. So you can see the difference here is the first time we're referring to name, which is a string object, okay? But the second time around we're doing lem to the names object here, which is a list object. So I'll show you what I mean by that. And let's do this, right? So we'll add a second argument here, and we'll just say type of name, whoops, type of name, and let's do the same thing again. Let's borrow that, and let's paste that here, and we'll say names. So this time what we'll do is, we'll find out that, as you can see, name, so the word Mohammed, the name Mohammed is 8 characters long. And we know that this is type string, okay? And when we do the same thing to the names identifier with the list, it tells us there are 4 items. So the len function, as I mentioned, works differently. It behaves differently when it's done to a list object and when it's done to an object that's a string. Right. The next thing we want to see is the commands for in and not in. And what this basically does is this kind of runs like a true-false statement, like an if statement, that will return true or false if an object, whether it's a string in this case, if you can see here, I'm saying if Python in languages. Now that's a string. In this case, we're using an integer, we're doing it to an integer, and we're saying if 6 not in. So we can use the in and not in together. Let's do an example of that. We'll say, in fact, we'll do it slightly differently. So you'll see how the in statement works. All right. So if I was to say Alice, and I say in names. Now I haven't done this in an if statement, but like I said, this does a conditional test. So if I run that, it says true because Alice is in the list names. If I was to say not in, then it should say false because Alice is in names. If I was to do a name that doesn't exist, such as Bob, then it should say true because Bob is not in names, right? The example on the slide is slightly different. That's because I'm using an if statement to check if the string is in languages. In this case, in this list, and in this one, we're checking integer. Right, guys, I've got a small task for you. I would like you to use the previous skills that we've looked at over the lessons that we've done. And I want you to take this list here that says computer brands. I want you to run a loop. So you're going to iterate over each item in the list. And I want you to use the len function as well. And just print out a string that says, for example, Apple is 5 characters long. ASUS is 4 characters long, and so on and so forth. Okay. I'm going to pause it for a moment. or sorry, you should pause it for a moment, try it out, and then when you unpause, I'll continue with the solution. So here's my computer brands. I'm going to run a for loop. So I'm going to say for item in computer brands. I'm going to say print, and let's make use of f strings to make our life easier. So no concatenation. We're going to say I want the item name. So I want item. So the first one will be apple is, and then I want to use that length function. So I'm going to say length of item is, oh no, sorry, that should say characters. Let's write chars for short, characters for short, long. So if I run that now, we're going to say for item in computer brands, it should say apple is 4 characters long, and then so on and so forth. Okay, so there's a quick solution. Okay, so another keyword, you should be taking notes, guys. I know I never say it, but so we spoke about list being static. Sorry, we said arrays are static. Now the next keyword I want you to note is that a list is mutable, which basically means that one, we can change the items inside it, so we can reassign the items, but we can also add more items and we can remove items, right? So if you can see this example here, I've got a fruit list. It says apple, banana, orange, and here I say fruit 1 equals grape. So in other words, mutable means that I can change the values inside a list. Right, here's one of our first list methods that we're going to learn. So just like before, we did this with string methods, right? We use what's called the dot method. So we use a dot, and then we use the method name or the function name. So here I'm saying my list.append, and append basically means add to the end, right? So my list here, my list just has one value. It's a number 1. If I say my list.append, it basically means add this value in between a parenthesis to the list. So now I've got two items, and it's added that new one to the end. The second list method we want to look at is, or are, both the remove and the pop function. Okay, now they're both used to remove items, and we will go through the difference. So the first one, remove, will look for the value or the string that you pass through in parentheses. So if I say favorite books.remove and I say the Gruffalo, in this case it's going to remove the third item or index item 2. Don't forget we're indexed, right? 0, 1, 2. So it's going to remove the Gruffalo. But the way the remove method works is it removes the first instance of the Gruffalo. So if there was the Gruffalo written twice, it will only remove the first one that it finds. Okay. And then the pop method removes the item with the index number. However, if you've been studying stacks and queues before watching this lesson, you'll probably notice that the pop function or method removes the last item in the list. Let's do an example. So I've taken us back to our list here, and let me copy that for fast pasting. So if I say methods.pop, and if I give an index item, let's do 1, it should remove ASUS, right? So let's print computer brands. So you should see that the first item is removed, which is ASUS, so Apple, and that's now missing. We've now got 3 items, okay? However, if I don't use a number, like I said, the pop method removes the last item from the list, whatever it is, right? So if I do that again, this time it's removed Samsung, and I've got 3 items and ASUS is still included. Okay, we've got one more. In fact, we have a few more to go through. Guys, I know that there are quite a few methods to go through here. Try to take note of these. The next one is the sort method, which simply just sorts items in order. So it's either in order of size, from small to big, or it's going to be in alphabetical order. However, There's a second method that you need to know, which is, the second one's a function, right? So when we look at list.sort, we know that sort is a method. However, a function on its own, which takes an argument of list, returns a new list and leaves the original untouched. So for example, here I've got my identifier numbers, I've got my list of numbers here. If I was to say sorted numbers equals sorted with the argument numbers, what happens is numbers stays untouched. So that list is in the same order as it was. It's not been changed. However, this new variable here that I've got, this new identifier, stores the sorted list under a new variable name. Okay, now here's the last thing I want to go through with you. There are a few other things I usually go through in lessons, but I try to make these videos as short as possible. So I've left some things out. I've left out like copying lists. It's in my notes. So when you look on the website and you click on the link for the Google Colab tasks, you should see notes there. So the first one is the reverse method, and what that's going to do is it's going to take the items in a list and it's going to put it in reverse order, but not reverse as in alphabetical. It's in order of however the letters were in the first place in the list. It just reverses it, right? However, if I use the dot sort and then reverse equals true, now what we're doing is we're taking the items and we're reversing them, but in alphabetical order. Well, from Z to A, right? So don't forget, if I didn't have this argument here and I said dot sort, it will take all of these items and it will put it in alphabetical order. Whereas at this time, because we're using the reverse equals sort argument, we're doing it from Z to A. Okay, guys, I don't want to make this video any longer than it has to be. As always, please like and subscribe. We want to see you in the next video, but I also want to see that you're confident. And so, as always, I have tasks for you to work on. Please click on the link in the description, go to our website and attempt the tasks. The more you practice, the more confident you become. We'll see you in the next video.